morning. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I just realized I'm a little bit worried that my fake eyelashes are coming off. They're really good for camera, but not good to actually wear. Hello, that's not how I was planning to start this talk. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here bright and early after karaoke last night. And thank you so much to React Rally for having me back a third time. I completely forgot about this until I pulled up these photos, but apparently the first time you could barely see my face. So hopefully you can this time, and it's been uphill since. But the first two times, I got to talk about React and using it with D3 and data visualizations, and I had such a fun time. You're honestly one of my favorite, oh, I think my notifications are not muted, hold on. Oh, okay. You're honestly one of my favorite conferences in the world because you're the first tech conference that has made me feel welcomed as a speaker and in a safe space of community. And that's why I really want to give this talk to you today, because it's a really personal one, like bordering on really vulnerable at times. And it's a talk that I only feel comfortable giving at 3 conferences in the world. And after these 3 conferences, I'm going to retire the talk. So having said that, I want to give a little disclaimer and set some expectations. This is a really beefy 45-minute talk where I mention React absolutely 0 times. Thank you. And there's no explicit takeaways, there's 0 technical lessons, and it is instead my love letter to you and the data visualization and wider web community that has given me so much. So I hope you'll receive it with kindness, and I really hope that you'll like it. When I was a child, I was loud and stubborn and always wanted things my way. Except that was the very opposite of a good Chinese girl, quiet and humble and demure, with senior that always knows her place. And as a Chinese kid growing up in the Japanese countryside in the 90s, honestly really brutal, if you know, you know. All I wanted was to fit in with my Japanese classmates and maybe make my parents proud. So I tried really hard to be quiet and humble and know my place. But then we moved to America when I was 10 years old, and suddenly it was okay for me to be loud and opinionated, and I felt so free to be exactly who I was. Until, that is, I got to high school and college, and I started being told that I was intimidating. I was intimidating in how I asked questions in speech and debate. I was intimidating in how I delivered my opinions in club meetings, even though in all of those instances, I was just being myself. And that was when I learned that in America, women are allowed to be loud and opinionated if she is fictional or if her opinions fit nicely within the patriarchal social norms that we have here. But at 16 and 19 and even 22, I didn't have the courage to defy those social norms. So just like how I felt the pressures to be a good Chinese girl growing up in Asia, I started to feel the pressures of being a socially acceptable American woman. And without even realizing it, I had made myself small. And by the time I started as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, I would second-guess myself every time I wanted to speak up in a meeting. And afterwards, I wondered to myself, did I say too much? Were my explanations too convoluted or meandering? Did I speak too aggressively? I had become afraid to take up space. I tried to make myself as non-threatening as possible, and I started to refer to my work as silly and make light of my accomplishments. That anyone who had put in the obscene number of hours that I have could do the exact same thing. I have made a small, socially acceptable box for myself, put myself squarely in it, and convinced myself that that was the place I belonged. Hi, I'm Shirley. I'm gonna pause here real quick and introduce myself before we get too deep into the story. I'm a software engineer, data visualization designer, storyteller. And I work with my clients on the full data analysis, design, and coding process so that we can turn their code or their data into awesome, beautiful, compelling visual narratives that push the boundaries of the web. I also co-author data sketches with my great friend Nadi Bremer, a hybrid coffee table and textbook where we detail the process behind 24 of our data visualization projects. And pre-pandemic, I used to give talks about the technical challenges I overcame and the lessons I learned while working on my projects. But today, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, where I've come from, how I've grown, and where I'm hoping to go from here. So let's get back into it. In 2016, I was 4 years into a full-time software engineering career. And I loved the data visualization product that I was working on, but I wasn't like the biggest fan of the industry I wasn't like the most excited about the industry I was in, which was enterprise security. So I decided to quit my full-time job and try my hand at freelancing, specifically with data visualizations, so that I could see what kind of projects and data sets and challenges were out there. It was a simultaneously really exciting, but also really, really stressful decision, but I was determined to make it work. That same summer, I became obsessed with Hamilton the musical. Yes, thank you. And I would listen to the cast recordings so often that I started to analyze the lyrics for repeated phrases and themes and made this piece called Interactive Data Visualization of Every Line in Hamilton, where each of these dots represent a set of lyrics sung by a character. And as you scroll, these dots burst apart and come back together. And at the very end, I present to you the filtering tool so that you can go in and do your own analysis. And the following year, I got to work with The Guardian and my friend Nadi on this piece, a story about all of the American cities that buy bus and plane tickets for their homeless people to relocate them elsewhere. These two pieces have so much more impact and reach than I could have ever expected. And they made me see my work in a whole new light. That this silly little data viz thing I do could actually inspire people, and incite conversations. And that gave me the validation that I needed to keep freelancing and doing what I love. And over time, I came to realize that what I really love is the freedom that comes with freelancing, that I get to choose the projects that I want to work on that really align with my interests. And that, in turn, helped me discover much more about myself. In 2018, I made my very first 3D data visualization. I have been wanting to make physical installations for a few years because I was obsessed with the idea of being fully immersed in a work, of being able to hold a person's full attentions as they walk through and experience the piece with their whole bodies instead of just their thumbs. Except for the longest time, I couldn't think of anything other than projecting my work onto a wall, which in my mind really kind of defeats the purpose of having that third dimension until I realized that, of course, that's all I could think of. I work on my laptop in 2D all day long. So perhaps if I wanted to design installations that really take advantage of that third dimension, then I could start by working on my laptop in 3D. And so I taught myself WebGL and 3JS and made Legends, a 3D data visualization of the 51 women Nobel laureates between 1901 and 2018, each represented as crystals. Size by their influence and color by the category of their award. And you can walk through and read about each of the women's life work, or you can fly up and see them arranged by the decade of their award. And here we can see that, especially in that first half of the century, there's barely any women Nobel laureates. And it's only been in the last 2 decades that their numbers have increased to the double digits. And each of these stars that you see floating all around them, each of these represent the more than 800 men that have won the award in the same amount of time. This project taught me so much about myself. For one, I was really taken aback and honestly quite incensed by this huge discrepancy in the number of female and male Nobel laureates. And it made me realize that I had barely ever seen women's names in the history and science textbooks that I studied out of in high school. And that, in turn, made me realize how deeply that lack of representation had impacted me, how I had subconsciously imprinted into my brain that women are not legacy worthy. And for the first time, I started to see how small I had made myself. How I had kept myself from dreaming anything bigger than that box I had made for myself. And all at once, I remembered my very first dream: to be an artist. Except I'd given up on that dream as soon as it had taken root, because even at 4 years old, I could feel the financial difficulty of that dream for my immigrant parent or family. But at 29, I was more financially secure, with a few more skill sets and much more confidence. And I became determined to be an artist. Except coming from tech, I had no idea the first thing about how to be an artist. So I applied to a series of artist residencies, all of which I got rejected from because, let's be real, I had no idea what I was doing. Until I got invited to be in residence at New York University's ITP, a master's program in art and technology. And I got to audit Intro to Physical Computing and learn about Arduinos and sensors and LEDs and motors, and Intro to Fabrication, where I got to learn how to think in 3D. And made this actually truly very silly drawing robot with 2 servo motors and 2 calligraphy pens. Like, this is actually hands down one of my favorite projects I've ever made in my life, because like, look at how it just kind of falls over and struggles a little bit but gets back up. Like, that's how I want to live my life. That is very inspiring. And I also recreated 5 of my Legends crystals with laser cut acrylic and LEDs. But what was the most exciting about being at ITP was all the inspiring people I got to meet. And I ended up collaborating with 2 of the students, Christina and Tina, on a follow-up of my Legends crystals. This is one amongst many. A physical data installation of 16 women in computing, each represented as a glowing orb hanging from the ceiling, and arranged in the space by the decade of their biggest achievements. And even though all of these women are just so cool and their contributions to the field of computing so badass, we had never heard of most of them before this project. So we decided to start the orbs dimly lit, and as people walked up to each of the orbs and read about the woman described inside, that orb would glow a little bit brighter and brighter and brighter until the whole field was brightly lit. The project was installed at ITP's 2019 winter show, where hundreds of people came through, with this website as the digital counterpart, so that anyone from around the world could read about each of these women. And please read about them, they're all just so cool. I didn't actually get to be at the show, but Tina and Christina made sure to send me plenty of photos and told me so many stories. And my favorite story of the night was from an older woman from the university's computer science department, who said that seeing this installation made her hopeful that one day people would honor her work in this way. This project was so far outside of my comfort zone technically, but I felt so supported by the ITP community into making it a reality, and had so much fun working with Tina and Christina that I felt emboldened and victorious, like I was literally bursting out of the box by taking up physical space. And that same week, on my 30th birthday, I finally dared to dream a new dream. Not an achievable goal like I've made so many times before, but a dream that felt so far out of reach. I want to make art that hundreds of thousands of people will come see, and I want to make them with the funnest, most talented team of my own. Except, if I'm gonna be honest with you and me, for the longest time I could barely whisper that dream out loud to myself because it just sounded so ridiculous. But every time I felt those doubts creeping in, I would remind myself of all those photos and stories, and I would hang on to my dream even tighter, and I would tell myself over and over that even if everybody else thought that this dream of mine was ridiculous and out of reach, that I will never be the one getting in my own way ever again. So I entered 2020, so bright-eyed and full of hope for all the physical things that I was going to make. And well, we all know what happened to that. I'm really grateful that all of our friends and family were safe and that we maintained the roof over our heads. But at the same time, I lost all of the clients that I was talking to because of budget freezes. Clients that never came back, and I went 7 months without income. And at first, I had no idea what to do with all of that unplanned free time. So I dove headfirst into this project called People of the Pandemic, a hyper-local cooperative simulation game, which became my way of trying to wrap my mind around all that was happening outside with the pandemic. And in retrospect, it was probably a very unhealthy coping mechanism for those first 2 months, where I just worked myself around the clock in denial. And by the time we finished the project, I was so burnt out that I could barely look at my laptop, and I spent the next month playing Animal Crossing and making really cute resin earrings, if I do say so myself, and I have no regrets. This was a great life decision. But I will repeat this process 2 more times of working myself to the extreme and burning out. The very last time on the final design layout for our data sketches book. And by the time that Nadi and I had handed in our final design files in December 2020, I had stared at my own words and my own work for a month straight and was in a burnout so deep that I could not bring myself to look at my past work for months. And perhaps most alarmingly, I felt so strongly that I never wanted to work on a data visualization project ever again, which, considering was the fact that it was how I made a living, was really quite alarming. And so I spent the next few months talking to friends and really introspecting, and I realized 2 important things about myself. One, that I still love telling stories with data. I was just temporarily exhausted from telling them on the web with all the different browsers and screen sizes and edge cases. And second, that I've always loved learning new things. That's why I fell in love with coding and data visualization in the first place. But finishing that book made me realize that I had reached the peak of what I wanted to learn making data visualizations, at least for the web. And I was deeply, deeply craving a change. And so I decided to listen to those gut feelings. And in fall 2021, I started as a graduate student at NYU ITP. And for that first year, I decided to, these videos are supposed to be playing. Okay, we'll ignore that. And for that first year, I decided to have 0 plan and just take the time to enjoy and take whatever physical computing and digital fabrication classes that I could. And I ended the year embracing the state of uncertainty that I was in. That I was in a place of great transition from one city to another, from one phase of my career into the next, and that, in fact, my whole life has been a series of transitions that have never fully settled, caught in between countries and cultures and places of belonging, and that is a lot to unpack. But fortunately, I've spent the past decade honing my skills, making data visualizations to understand the outside world. And now I have the time and space to make work and understand myself. And I got that opportunity one beautiful night last September where I got to put on a one-night pop-up art show, my very first solo show. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is Wonder and Hope, where each dot represents a photo I've taken between 2018 and 2022. And a flower means that I had taken a photo of a flower. There's a lot of those. And a double circle means that it's a food photo. There's even more of those. And it's double circles because it looks like a plate. And the small dot represents all other photos. They're positioned by where I took the photo. So the further away from the center, the further away I was from home. And if they're within that solid inner circle, it means that I was at home when I took the photo. And I had a lot of fun thinking about how I would translate web elements into the physical, and I ended up creating all of these physical layers, like the layers of the DOM. So I printed the dots and flowers of the visualization in color on paper, and I think of that as my HTML5 canvas layer. And I laser etched the annotations on transparent acrylic, and that's my SVG layer. And because the acrylic has this slight bit of thickness, it casts this like really beautiful IRL drop shadow. I don't know if you can see it like right here. And then I had the instructions for how to read the visualization and the actual stories on on more layers. And I think of those as the divs that you scroll past on a web page. So as you walk through this first half of the room, you're physically scrolling through my story about all the wonder that I used to feel being outside. And this first half also serves as the onboarding for the main visualization. And as you turn the corner, you come across March 2020, the first month of the pandemic in America. And you see that all of those dots have shrunk to be within just that solid inner circle of home. And underneath is the main visualization animating within a bowl of water, where water drips from above, and each drop represents a case of anti-Asian hate crime reported to NYPD during that same time frame. And the way that the water distorts the image is the best visual that I could give for how distorted reality felt at that time. And then you turn again, and you come across this triptych of the first 3 months of the pandemic, when we only ever left home to go do groceries. And in this latter half of the story, I talk about the effects that reading all of those reports of anti-Asian hate crimes had on me, of how panicked I would feel every time I had to go outside by myself, of how I would keep my eyes firmly on the ground because I was afraid that if I just looked up and accidentally made eye contact, that would be the trigger for a hate crime. And in March 2022, I realized that I had lost all the wonder that I used to feel being outside. And I was filled instead with an all-consuming fear and anxiety. And after that, I forced myself to look up and around whenever possible. Until one day in April, when I look up and I see the first flowers blooming, and for the first time in a long time, I feel the joy overtake the fear, and I feel hope again. And as you finish reading the story, you look up and you realize that the flowers have been overhead this entire time, gently lighting up as you walked underneath. The show was a big one. It was the very first time that I used data to try and understand myself and work through my own experiences. And letting all of those emotions and anxieties take up a whole room of space was incredibly cathartic and validating. It was also the first time I had asked for help on something so utterly personal, and I'm grateful to all of my friends that asked my panicked calls for help and spent 10-hour days with me fabricating and installing. It's also the first time that I got to see all the people that showed up in person. And I think maybe a lot of us here can relate that when we make something digital and put it out onto the web, we never truly get to know all the people that we might have reached. I mean, we might, in retrospect, know by some page numbers, or maybe people are truly really kind and they reach out after and tell us what they thought. But with this show, I got to see each single person that showed up, and I got to see their reactions to my stories in real time. And I got to see them as they read my story, as they teared up with me, and as they smiled with me, and as they gave me hugs after. And those reactions, those moments of connection and community were so beautiful and magical and healing that I knew that going into my thesis that I wanted to take this opportunity to work through some things, like some deep emotional things, so that hopefully by the time I graduated, I have a fresh new start. And I also knew that I wanted these personal stories to take on physical form where they felt just more real and intimate and powerful. And in this progress, or in this process of digging really deep and introspecting, I found rage. Deeply rooted, quiet and simmering rage. And I found two sides to this rage. First, from my childhood and the quiet trauma that I inherited from my parents, who, by the time I was 10 years old, had made 4 life-changing moves from China to the Philippines, Philippines to back to China, from China to Japan, and Japan to America, taking me with them on all but the first. And the second, from my adulthood and my time as a woman in tech. I wrote this in my thesis paper. The Silicon Valley sexism I encountered was the most spectacular forms of gaslighting and undermining. By the end of my 4 years working full-time, I had a disproportionately low opinion of my work. I had once read that being a woman or person of color in tech was like a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Countless microaggressions, each too negligible to report, but excruciating as they added up. It resonated so perfectly that it was painful. It took me years to realize how small I had made myself. And it took me even more years to regain the confidence to acknowledge that I am spectacularly good at what I do. And for that, I have the data visualization and broader web community to thank. Free from the politics of a small but successful startup, they celebrated every project I've ever put out. They told me over and over again that I am incredible at what I do. 6 years after I left full-time, I finally wholeheartedly believe them. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. A week after I wrote those very words, this project of mine won Most Beautiful out of 1,300 entries, the highest honor given at the Information is Beautiful Awards, one of the most important awards in the data visualization industry. And in that moment, not this exact moment, because this moment I was like freaking the fuck out, but I was like rambling so hard. But on that train ride home, I finally felt a deep sense of calm. And I no longer felt that desperate need to constantly prove myself and my technical capabilities, a remnant from my time in tech. And I felt instead fully at peace with myself and the work that I make. And I came home and I performed this piece, a story with almost no words, where the colors I paint are turned into sounds, and each drop of Chinese calligraphy ink represents a case of anti-Asian hate crime reported to NYPD. And by March 2021, the amount of black ink becomes overwhelming. And I am forced to reconcile with it. And this piece, called "Though a Patriarchy Would Privilege the Changelessness of the Sun over the Inconstancy of the Moon and You." It is inspired by the shame that I used to feel in my teenage years, that my period never came on the same days of that month, and that somehow my body was abnormal because of that irregularity. Until I started trying a period tracking app, and it taught me that my body is actually very, very regular, and what was actually highly irregular is the solar calendar, which shifts from 31 days to 30 days to 28 days to sometimes even 29 days in a month. And that was when I realized that the problem is not me. And then I continued on with my thesis. And I ended up proposing 2 physical installations for the 2 sides of my rage, and decided to concentrate on just that first one about my childhood. And as a starting point, I was deeply inspired by Stephanie Fu's life-altering memoir called "What My Bones Know." And in it, she writes, "I realized that my community in San Jose was built in large part from the wreckage of America's brutal proxy wars against communism. America massacred civilians in Nokuni and Milai. It poisoned fields of crops and buried mines. It left behind machine guns in the wrong hands and let houses turn to rubble. San Jose is America's consolation prize for those who lost Saigon and Seoul. I also spoke to dozens of Asian children of immigrants, Asians of my generation. Everyone always wanted me to know that their parents were good people. They came here with nothing. They overcame so much. They're just, stoic, anxious, quiet." And I became fascinated with this dichotomy of being an immigrant, arriving in a new country filled with so much hope and expectation, and finding a reality so vastly different. This is my thesis, titled Untitled, We Still Land Home, where Chinese calligraphy ink drips from above, each drop representing a number of Chinese immigrants into America. And I think of the fabric as the American land and all of the fans underneath the fabric as the American sentiments against Chinese immigration that are literally making the fabric into difficult terrain for the ink to land on. And over the course of a few hours, the ink makes its slow, methodical way from the back of the fabric to the front, dispensing ink according to immigration data from 1850 to now. In the process of working on this piece, I realized that I was asking it questions that I could never bring myself to ask my parents. What was it like to leave home and have to start over and over again, so far from your full support networks? Did you ever have to feel discrimination and fight to survive? Did you ever feel a powerlessness, a voicelessness in each new country with each new language? Did you ever expect to pass that down to me? And the piece answers me with each drop of ink that lands not where intended, but instead messily scattering in every direction freely. And I think of all the lives that each drop represents, all the lives lived, struggled, settled. 1,000 different imaginings for 1,000,000 different lives. And I am reminded that even if we don't land where we intended, we still land. And we make homes for ourselves. And there is such beauty in that resilience. I think of this piece as the first working prototype for that idea, and there's so much more that I want to improve on for the next iterations. But for now, I am so grateful for all that it has taught me about myself. I've come to really love working with motors because it literally lets me move the world around me. That I really enjoy working with water and ink and air and wind because they feel like the soothing balms to my rage. And if I could just succeed in keeping my visual forms simple and elegant, that would be the biggest defiance I could have against the incessant pressures I've felt as a woman in tech to constantly prove myself and my worth. And I love with an almost vengeance that I am using every last drop of skill that I have gained through my time in tech to make these pieces and regain my power. I graduated 3 months ago, almost exactly to the day, and I still have no idea what the future looks like. And I still have no idea the A to the B to the C or any of the steps in between of how I'm going to get to that big, big dream of mine. But for now, what I do know is I've been doing a lot of reflecting on how I might want to go forward. And I've come to the realization that I'm really, really excited to get back into coding and get back into the web again. Because after these 2 years away, I've really missed it. And so I've been trying to figure out how to combine and balance my client work with my self-funded artwork in the hopes that hopefully one day in the future soon, hopefully, that they'll converge. And I can just concentrate on telling my stories in whatever mediums that fit them best. And as for that box, some days I am still filled with so much rage, and I'm like, fuck the box, fuck the social norms, and I'm gonna be everything the way I am, and if that's intimidating, then deal with it. And some days I still just wanna slip back into that box. But more and more, I'm excited to open up that box so that I can define myself exactly the way that I deserve. So, hello again. My name is Shirley. I'm a Chinese American woman, proud daughter of immigrants, software engineer, data visualization designer, storyteller, solopreneur, creative director, artist. And I'm here to take up space. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much